Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest TASC podcast, the show where we talk about the important issues and topics facing the UK's ambulance community. I'm Karl Demian, and I'm the Chief Executive at the Ambulance Staff Charity, or as we're often known, TASC. At TASC, we are incredibly proud to have arranged and hosted the National Ambulance Memorial Service since 2015. And as we look forward to the next service in September of this year, we're looking back on the history of the service, why it's important, how it was created, and I'm happy to be joined by three of our trustees, some of our longest serving trustees. Gordon Enstone, who's currently acting as chair of TASC, Carl Ledbury, one of our longest serving trustees, who also works with the ambulance community at various ceremonial events, including Remembrance Sunday, and Jerry Brown, who is again a long-serving member of the ambulance community with years of experience, but also is one of the people that was involved in the creation of the Memorial Garden and the service itself. And interestingly, between them all, this always embarrasses me slightly when I say this, because they're all looking extremely young and fit and healthy today on the call. They have over 120 years experience, both in the NHS ambulance service, but also in the independent ambulance sector as well between them. And we're going to learn a bit more today about what the service means and how it was created. But firstly, what I'd like to do is to talk to each of you in turn and to ask you why you think the service is important. And perhaps starting with you, Jerry, why was the service created by the Ambulance Benevolent Fund back in 2004? And that was when it was launched, but there must have gone a lot of work. So why was it important, Jerry?
It was originally the idea of Gordon Turnbull, who was the old Chief of Suffolk, and Norman Laking, who was the Chief Officer at Bedfordshire. They were the founders of the original Ambulance Service Benevolent Fund, and they always felt that the service needed a permanent memorial. Having initiated a book of remembrance, which they did in mid-2002, it then fell to Norman Laking that he discovered that there was a national memorial arboretum in Staffordshire that wasn't advertised nationally, that very few people knew about, but it was mainly for the military services. Anyway, he approached these people to say, was it possible for the Ambulance Service Benevolent Fund and on behalf of the ambulance service in general to actually have a memorial garden? And this, over a period of months, was negotiated, and it subsequently became the memorial that we know today.
Thank you, Jerry. And Carl, you're quite heavily involved in some of the larger memorial events that take place across the country, and Remembrance Sunday particularly, where you've organised the ambulance presence at those events. But also recently, you were also involved at the ambulance presence at both the coronation of the current king, but also at the funeral of the late Queen. Why do you think this particular event is important to you and to the people that work within the ambulance community?
Yeah, Carl, I think the importance is, and it was recognised by both Gordon and Norman many years ago. And I mean, I had a conversation with them both in the early stages as well. And I think we need to also remember Simon Firmer, who was very instrumental in it all as well at the time, and the Ambulance Service Benevolent Fund Committee as a whole, who were the driving force behind it. The ambulance service has always been referred to this Cinderella service. You always see the police and the fire service were always held quite high in esteem. The ambulance service was referred to occasionally, not as a regular basis as the other. And I think the problem being is that uh, the police and the fire service have a longer time at a particular incident. The ambulance service has a tendency to go in, deal with it, and get away. So, of course, that's where they've never been seen. And one of the highlights that was going on in the early 2000s was to try and increase the awareness of the ambulance service, but also within the ambulance community. We felt there was very little memorial to ambulance staff who'd actually died either in service or during service. During service, we're glad to say were very, very few, but there have been some over the years. Um, and as Jerry has said, the roll of honour was sort of devised first and then the memorial. Why is it important to remember? I think that, the whole community of the ambulance service doesn't get enough recognition, but we recognise ourselves. And to do that, the memorial became very important for us to remember fallen colleagues, like they do within the other services. So it was putting us on an equal par to them. And then for years, we tried to increase that profile. Unfortunately, we were quite lucky back in 2008 or thereabouts. We got invited to attend the National Remembrance Day parade in London at the Cenotaph. And from there, the guy who was sort of organised at the time, it was sort of an add-on to his responsibility. And then I was approached, would I be interested to do it on behalf of the ambulance service? I got support, and I've been very proud, very honoured, and very privileged to be able to organise representatives at that event every year. We've made a little bit of an inway this year as the parade is split into two. There's two contingents, number one contingent and number two contingent of the uniformed civilian services, who form 25% of the honour guard around the cenotaph. But this year, number two detachment, an invitation was made for the ambulance service to be the commander for that detachment. And I'm very pleased to say that Darren Mockery, who's the chair of the Association of Ambulance Chief Execs and also the Chief Ambulance Officer for North West Ambulance Service, is going to be taking on that role. So, things are moving on. We've also now got regular attendance at the Remembrance Parade at the Royal Albert Hall. The Festival of Remembrance that takes there as part of the civilian muster. We have two members of the ambulance service that attended that. And you did say about the involvement with the Queen's funeral and the coronation of King Charles III, which again was another proud moment of being able to get representatives of the ambulance service at both of those events. And I think that sums up why I think the importance is there. It's the memorial, then the recognition of our staff within the ambulance services, and those have gone before us.
Oh, so yeah, thank you, Carl. That's really interesting, because what it leads me on to my sort of next sort of question, which is going to go to Gordon, but a reflection on both what you and Jerry have said is very much about how it was having something that recognised what was going on, that belonged and was owned by the ambulance community themselves, but also has had that knock-on effect of raising the profile of the great work that's being done within the ambulance community. So really, that's great work. And Gordon, it's sort of, you've been involved with TASC for quite a while now, the ambulance staff charity, as well as other things. But one of the things that you do, which is tucked away, we've done a feature on you before on our website, which is the production of the badges that you produce each year, or because I think it's worth saying at this point, we used to host it every 2 years, but because it's become so important, which builds on what Carl and Jerry were saying, we've now moved to annual. So every year, Gordon, you design, produce, and sell on your eBay site, or our eBay site, the memorial badges. So you have quite a lot of a lot of contact with people, and we sell large numbers of those badges. So why do you think the to the ordinary, if there is such a thing, ambulance uh, person, that the badges and the service is important? Why do people buy the badges, for example? What's important about it?
That's a good question. I mean, there are various reasons why people do buy these badges. And I've been doing it since 2010, when I produced the first badge. And it went down very well in as much as that we were trying to promote the memorial service and remember uh, the people that have died or passed away or whatever their circumstances, to remember our colleagues. I mean, Norman was my chief ambulance officer actually when he moved to Hertfordshire, and he was very passionate about staff, and he always remembered the ones that had passed by, and he remembered the ones that was killed. And I think, along with Gordon Turnbull, as I said, um, it always thought he must do something for staff. And when he joined into Hertfordshire, he made sure that we had a fund for our own staff in Hertfordshire, which I was part of as well. But going back to the badges, he always thought that he would like something that would represent the passing of staff. And he came up with, like, as Karl knows, least we forget, which obviously goes back to the Royal British Legion. And we started to design it on a basis similar to that. And we've moved on from there, but still remembering that there is, and I've stolen from the police their thin blue line and the fire service with their thin red line. And we've moved it onto the thin green line, which unfortunately during the COVID got very thin and stretched beyond belief, really, and not only for the staff but the patients as well. And therefore, every year I come up with an idea of how we're going to promote this year, how we're going to represent the staff. And I have about 14 volunteers who sell these badges on their hubs or within the community, whatever they do. And I always do a design, send it out to them and ask them their opinion. And they come back with various ideas. And as you know, I send it to HQ and you come back with your ideas. So in the end, we come up with a design that hopefully represents what we're trying to achieve and represents the staff. And that is the problem. Representing every member of staff within the ambulance service is not easy. I'll get told to represent the frontline staff, and then I get told to represent the control room staff, then I get told to represent the cleaners and washers, the stockers and washers, sorry. And then I get told, well, what about the secretarial and the mechanic? So every year I get the ideas of what to put on it, and I end up basically trying to achieve the impossible. But it sells, and we sell between 2,000 and 3,000 a year, which helps the fund immensely. And I hope that this staff realise that it does go into the fund and it does help us.
Thanks, Gordon. It's really interesting about the badges and the designs. And I'm really quite pleased that we make life hard for you, because it's really important that we do recognise everyone that works in the ambulance community. That's important. Jerry, I'd like to go back a bit, because when you talked about how the memorial garden came about and the first event took place, you made it all sound rather straightforward and easy, and I'm sure that it wasn't. And anybody that's ever tried to set up anything like this will understand it's difficult. But I understand that you had played quite a part in the actual design of the memorial garden itself. And could you tell us a
Yeah,
little bit about your thinking behind that?
yeah, sure. I volunteered as in my previous existence, I was a construction engineer, to actually take on design work of the garden. And it was initially, when the subcommittee discussed it, we said we would want a memorial, almost like a headstone, which is what it eventually turned out to be, but something that reflected the ambulance service as a whole. So we initially thought about having our logo, the Ambulance Service Benevolent Fund logo, on the stone, which was a swan. But we thought that wasn't representative of the ambulance service generally. So we eventually went for the Star of Life, the six-pointed Star of Life. And of course, then I designed the rest of the garden around the stone, so that the paths were laid out as a capital A, with the stone literally in the middle of the A. And Norman took on purchasing the stone from a local mason that he knew. And I took on, apart from designing the garden, trying to get the Star of Life made. And we decided it had to be a white metal because it needed to be there for a long time, and a white metal casting. And then we had to try and get it made. And the issue was, we decided that since a lot of the paramedics that were in the service were fairly keen on Formula One and motorsports in general, and as you know, or maybe you don't know, but motorsports couldn't exist without the volunteer paramedics around stewarding the course. I approached actually McLaren Formula One team to see whether they could cast this white metal casting, which, as you know, most Formula One cars have white metal castings in them. And while they said yes, it was something that they would normally do and could do, in the middle of the season, they didn't have the capacity to actually make this for us. So we were desperately hunting around, and Mike Saunders, who was actually my divisional commander at the time, who was also chair of the Benevolent Fund, his son was at university doing industrial design. And he spoke to Darren, and Darren was able, through the university, to actually get the Star of Life made and anodized for us. So the blue in the middle is actually anodized onto the white casting. And eventually it all came together. From September 2002 was when the subcommittee was set up. And as you know, the first memorial garden was consecrated in 2004. So it did take a little while. But with regard to the trees which were planted around the plot, they were chestnut and beech. And this was suggested by Norman. As he said, the poles that we used to use on, and those older hands amongst us will remember stretcher canvases and poles that used to be chestnut. And the beech, where they used to make the splints, the full leg splints, which were plywood, were actually beech ply. Hence, so the whole garden was surrounded with beech and chestnut, which is where that came from. Yeah. So
that's absolutely fascinating. It's a pity we're not doing video for this, because when Jerry talked about the wood that was used on the stretcher bearers, the beech, etc., Gordon and Karl's faces lit up with fond memories. Because I suspect for lots of the younger people that work in the ambulance community, that wouldn't trigger the same thing. So it's really good to capture that design detail.
Completely alien to them, Karl.
Yeah, to capture that design detail. So, because sometimes this is what people forget, that the history of these sorts of events is often really grounded in the history of the services and the people that they remember. So that's really key. So can't remember which of you three were there at the 2004 inauguration, but Jerry, you certainly were, I think. Were you there, Gordon?
No, I didn't go until 2008.
And I think the same for Carl.
Yeah.
So,
No, I was
Jerry,
there in 2004.
great. So I'll start with Carl, then come back to you, Jerry. So, Carl, what was it like? What took place? How many people were there? What's your most important memory of the day, Carl?
Rosie Winterton, who was the Secretary of State for Health at the time, had agreed to come along to do the initial inauguration. And I just remember there was this melee of people. There was some speeches that took place, and then there was like a formal unveiling. But detail of it is a little bit of a blur to me on that occasion. You know, I remember that there was a piper that did a lament. We had some flagpoles as well, if I remember, just beyond where the headstone was, the main memorial. And I think it was one of the first times the ambulance service standard was actually flown on a flagpole there, along with the Union flag as well. So it was a very touching day. I remember that, but there was lots that went on, and there was lots of people there. I'm tempted to say probably in the region of probably about 200 people, but I can't remember. Yeah.
Jerry, and apart from feeling very relieved that you got there, what are your memories of the day?
There was. It was probably the first time that the ambulance standard was flown. It's true. The flagpoles actually were in situ before the garden was made, so that formed the backdrop of our garden, or the original garden, I must say, because it's been moved twice since. And it was quite moving. We had the Bishop of Gloucester that came down and consecrated the stone. And he had stepped in at the last minute because the original guy was the Bishop of Lichfield, whose son Paul was actually chief ambulance officer in Sussex at the time. So he was very keen supporter. He in fact died 3 weeks before the opening, which was rather tragic. But the Bishop of Gloucester stepped in, bless him, and it did go as we planned, thank goodness. And I think everyone was impressed that we'd managed to get this position, which was actually at the entrance to the Arboretum. So our plot was the first one that anyone saw when they drove in. Now, I must say at this time, the original Arboretum wasn't owned by the Royal British Legion. It was a private company that had been set up to handle the land that was given to them by Amy Roadstone. It had originally been a quarry, and all the sand and gravel had been extracted. And Amy Roadstone had literally donated the land to this Arboretum, and it went ahead. It was great. We all shook hands with Rosie Winterton, and we had tea afterwards, which was nice. And I think it was a shame. It was probably one of Norman's last actions, because he was actually in the early stages of mesothelioma, which he didn't know about, which was undiagnosed. He'd been ill for a little while, and it actually took them 18 months to diagnose. But he was able to be there, which was great because it was his little baby, and we were so glad he was fit enough to come and be there at the time.
I always remember, Jerry, that his wife used to always accompany him and come to the memorials and that. And unfortunately, after Norman died as well, she came that following year as well.
She did.
Which was very touching as well.
It was, yeah. She supported him in everything he did. Yeah. Really
I mean, Simon used to pick her up and bring her up to the memorial service. Simon Firmer, that is, who did a lot for the Ambulance Service Benevolent Fund. Yeah,
it was really good. It was a shame. We had one of our last quarterly meetings actually at his home because he was too ill to travel. But so he did see his baby come to fruition, which was great.
It's really interesting as to, what goes into producing this and how much effort is required, and how things, both change and stay the same in terms of how moving it is, what goes on, etc., and the design. So just moving us forward a little, in 20, well, TASC took over the hosting of the service, Gordon, in 2015. How did that come about?
Well, it only came about because we changed our name. We got a legacy and set up the headquarters in Coventry. And with that, we changed the name from the Ambulance Service Benevolent Fund, as we felt that we were more than a benevolent fund, and the name was changed from that to a charity. And we had a meeting in London and changed the name from ASBF to TASC, the Ambulance Service Charity. It started off then, and then we changed it to the staff later on. So it was a smooth transition, really, and it really was the way forward to keep the memorial going, and every 2 years. And then unfortunately COVID came along and really upset the apple cart, and then we've started to hold it annually ever since, which, to be honest, I felt it should have been annually every time, but we couldn't afford it under the ASBF days to do it every year. And now, so it was done every 2 years. And I'm really pleased that we managed to get it, and we've managed to acquire some money from our sponsors to help us do it every year. And it's been very good, and more attendance every year has come forward, and it's pleasing to see the number of people that do turn up and lay a wreath at their service. And I think everyone mingles afterwards, have a chat over a cup of tea and a bun, and it really is pleasing to see everybody talking to each other.
And you touched a couple of interesting points there, Gordon. The first one for me is, that we started with why is it important, and how is it supported, and for a number of years, as you say, the benevolent fund and then TASC struggled to fund it more than once every 2 years. But for the last couple of years, the principal sponsor of the event has been the Association of Chief Executives of Ambulance Trusts, which has been really excellent and have provided the funding without wanting anything in return, which is always excellent. And we've had a few corporate sponsors as well that have come forward. So that's a testament to the work that's been done. But you've mentioned COVID, and COVID was one of the reasons we looked at moving it to annually, because I remember being involved myself. The first one I was really involved in was should have been the 2020 event, which of course we couldn't hold because of the social distancing requirements. And I remember myself, Diane Scott, who was the chair, and Anthony Marsh, who was and still is the chief officer at West Midlands Ambulance Service, and a few others, actually attended the event because we were limited to 6 people, and videoed it and found that extremely poignant. And I think at the suggestion of you all, we held the next event out of sequence, which was 2021. And that was an incredible event attended by many people. And I remember being at the Memorial Garden after the initial service, where we read out the roll of honour of those people who are no longer with us during looking back to the last service. And that roll of honour was unsurprisingly very, very long, and it was a very sad event. And we then recognised that we needed to keep growing the service. We'd outgrown the chapel. For those of you that have ever been to the Arboretum, we'd always use the chapel. But on that particular event in 2021, it was standing room only inside, and we had to put seating outside. and that prompted us to move to using the visitor centre that's there, which is enabling us now to hold more people. But I think, my impression is we've changed the service slightly, we've changed the way it operates, but it's interesting, we've kept a lot of the core elements, I think, in terms of the Piper Lament, the reading of the Roll of Honour, and we've preserved the tradition and the continuity of the whole event, which is very, very moving. And as Gordon says, people come along to remember, to meet friends and colleagues. And I think it's really important. And the other point you make, Gordon, is that continuity, that the ambulance staff charity isn't a charity that somebody thought, let's set up. It's actually grown out of the people who worked in the ambulance service, who actually wanted to support their colleagues and have helped to grow it. Hence you three on the podcast this morning. So just as a way of sort of thinking forward as well as back, Jerry, you've been involved in a long time. What are your hopes for the future of the service? What would you like to see?
That's a good question, Carl. I would say recognition, but I mean, we are doing fairly well now, and I think it's through TASC well-being as well as TASC itself. Now we're getting to be much better known for the services that we provide, and I think if I had a lasting legacy, I hope it would be that we did all we could for the staff in the ambulance service. And particularly those who are struggling, because the way the world is at the moment, it needs all the help it can get, the ambulance service.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting, because one of the things for me about it is the service is it is remembrance, but also we do celebrate the work that we at TASC do to support the people who are with us, who are still working, etc. So that's really important. Thank you. Karl, the same sort of question to you. What do you hope for the service going forward?
I hope it continues, which is the big thing. We've built it up now to this annual event, which has become more and more recognised. Not necessarily needed, but it is important there to remember fallen colleagues, and that is what it's doing. But it's also an event which is not too somber. It is balanced just right, giving the right parts in the right place for that memorial to take place. And with it being centred in both the visitor centre now, because of the numbers, and then moving down to the memorial garden, I think we have the right balance there. Just hope that we can keep the weather as we've always so far had a dry day for the memorial service. But one of the things I want to say, Carl, is Jerry and Gordon and Norman and various other people over the years, have really worked hard for this, and it is a tribute to them, really, and in particular Simon Firma. Because Simon worked really hard as the secretary of the Old Ambulance Service Benevolent Fund, and brought this all together. It was all right, people having an idea and sort of suggesting things, but Simon was the linchpin of coordinating it all. Norman was the main driving force behind it all, and supported by a lot of other people. But without those, we wouldn't have this memorial and the service that we now do every 12 months. And I think it's important to remember them as well as everybody else at this time.
Thank you, Karl. That is important. That continuity, that recognition that you can have an idea, but actually taking it requires hard work, resilience, tenacity, resources, and vision to make it actually happen and hold on to it. But Gordon, what your thoughts on the future?
It's funny, I'm sitting here listening to my colleagues And I was thinking, I looked back in the past, and I was at an ambulance officers training course down in Southwold in Kent, and there was a producer there from BBC, and we all sat around talking about what we felt in the ambulance service, and we said then that we were unrepresentative through to the whole country. People disregard, kept calling us ambulance drivers, and that was it. That's how casualties set up. So I'm one of the persons in that group that set up casualty that you on television every Saturday night. So it's strange. And then people became more interested and things have moved on. Our staff had changed from predominantly male to now nearly 50%, maybe over 50% in some trusts of female staff. And it's brought a different ethos to the ambulance service and the different way we now look after staff and patients. And I think that that's the way forward, that we've moved now to such professionalism within the service. I listen to patients. Unfortunately, I go to hospital a few times myself, and I sit there, and when patients are brought in by either PTS or by the main crews, and you hear the patients talking about how nice they were treated from being picked up within the house, how they were looked after in the ambulance, and the professionalism of all the staff. And I've yet to hear a bad word when I've been sitting there listening to these people. And I think that's the way we are going. And I see every time I come to a memorial from staff from all over the country, from Scotland way down to Cornwall and the little islands of the country, Isle of Man, Jersey, and last year from Gibraltar. But it's so nice that everyone gets on and represents the staff as a whole. And to me, I've always, as a manager at the time, always thought about ambulance welfare, and I think TASC has done that brilliantly, the way we move forward, and hope it continues.
And again, the points you've all made are really interesting. I mean, TASC exists to do exactly what you're talking about there. And we, as a staff group, see the memorial service, the now annual memorial service, it's been a really critical part of what we do, both in terms of raising awareness of the individual sacrifices that are made by all in the ambulance service. And you touched earlier on the problems we give you over the design of your badges, Gordon, about representing everyone. The key part of this service is for everyone that works in the ambulance service, including volunteers, included retired, the independent sector. It's not just about the paramedics and the technicians, it's the control room. It's the people that keep the ambulance on the road. It's patient transport. And it's worth remembering that one of the longest lists that we read out of the occupations within the ambulance service after COVID was people involved in patient transport at that time. So the service is there for everyone. It's really key. And listening to all of your reflections about services in the past, one thing that I do hope is that anyone that was there in 2004, if they came to the service that's coming up on the 19th of September, would not only recognise it, but would see how it had changed and grown and developed, but could still see that people talk about the golden thread, and I think there is a golden thread here. It goes back from those original working groups, little committees that were set up, fundraising activities, to what the service will look like on the 19th of September. There'll be different elements, different things, different faces. As Gordon has touched on, perhaps a more diverse group of people in attendance. We won't have Rosie Winterton or an MP this time unless we strike lucky. but would actually see how it's gone, how it's developed, and how how it remains, I think, what it should be, which is an opportunity to remember, to quietly reflect, but also to celebrate the work and the life of everyone that's been involved. So we look forward to many more services. Um, I'd like to thank all of you, Jerry, Carl, and Gordon, for taking the time this morning, but also to thank you that for over the years, all of the effort that you've put in, that we as a staff team and myself particularly who take over some of the responsibility for making this happen, how you've made our lives much easier in terms of the organisation, but also have ensured, and this is the key part, that we maintain that golden thread back to the original idea. And I think we can see it stretching into the future. Um, more, more and more recognition for the service and recognition of the importance of this one day to take a little bit of time and reflect. So thank you all for your time today. A little bit of a trip down memory lane, but that's really important we capture it. So again, Carl, Jerry, Gordon, thank you for joining us today. And to everyone out there listening to this, thank you for taking the time to listen.